Hello, folks. So yeah, I think we can begin today's meeting. And thank you all for joining OAM community meeting. So today I will let Ran from Alibaba side to host the meeting. So Ran.
Welcome everyone. So today we have a lot of stuff in our agenda. Many things are happening today. So we have an updated agenda here. So first, I think Lei, do you wanna update us with the experience with, or maybe Hongchao, maybe Hongchao here? Yeah. Either of you wanna update us on the experience with GitOps and OAM? I think CNCF we're going to have a blog published on CNCF.
Yeah, I can start the describe this a little bit so Hongchao can add after I finish the description. So let me share my screen a little bit. Okay, so if you look at the agenda, we do have a blog post. This blog post is currently a public draft. So it's public, everybody can see that, but it will be finally published on the CNCF official blog. So this is a co-author blog from Argo community and OAM community. So we will use Kubevela as an example to show how the GitOps and OAM can be used in the production environment. For example, if we put such kind of app file under the directory of your application to describe your application in a single source of truth, simple YAML file like this, then you can basically use tools like Argo CD or any kind of GitOps tools to trigger the deployment rollout of your application based on the change on this single source of truth. And of course, behind this app file is basically OAM component and app config. So this is just a wrapper of this. So the user can just define everything in a single file, which is more naturally fit to the model of GitOps. But in order to make this happen, there are some trick need to be done on the GitOps tool side. So this blog actually explain a little bit what need to be done. Basically, you need to configure the GitOps tool to understand, okay, there is a single source of truth file, which name is app file. So the GitOps tool need to know, okay, what this file will be rendered to, right? So because they need to know, okay, actually behind that file is actually a component and app config. That's why you need to configure the GitOps tools like this to let it know that there is what is underneath behind this app file. So app file itself is basically UI. So as long as you've done all of these steps, 3 steps actually, so the Argo CD will understand, okay, there is a plugin which name is, for example, Vela, or you can say OAM, you can give it just its name, and it will understand, okay, the model object behind this representation layer. So you can basically use anything to wrap your own model objects. You can use your on DSL like JSONNet, QSONNet, Q. Microsoft has BiCap, so you can basically use any DSL to represent your object. The only thing you should do is just configure the GitOps tool like Argo CD plugin to say, okay, how to render the model object. That's all. So then you can just deploy and create your GitOps application by using vanilla Argo CD command line like this. Just tell it that you want to use your own plugin, and then that's all. Then the Argo CD will check the status of your application. If you update your app file, Argo CD will redeploy your application automatically. So this is basically how the high-level model works. So the only thing we added is to let Argo CD know how to render the OAM object from the UI object like FL or any DSL. Argo CD, if you look at its plugin system, you can see almost every DSL is supported by default, or even it's not supported, you can just add a plugin by yourself like this to tell it how to render this render your own app file or render your own DSL. So this is basically how this whole thing works. And as long as you configure the plugin, you can also use the Argo CD dashboard to create the application and check the application. So anything is just like normal GitOps way if you want to deploy something on Kubernetes. So also you can also notice that today most GitOps tool it's actually built at top of Kubernetes. So it assumes that what you need to render is basically a Kubernetes object. But luckily, OAM object, there are Kubernetes objects. So you just need to tell the tool how to render. That's all. So this is basically the blog post is about. If you're interested in this topic, you can check its content and let us know if you have any feedback. And we will do a demo when this blog post is published, and we will record the demo and show off in this community meeting. So maybe just the next meeting we can do that. Right. This is basically I want to share with the community. I'm not sure if Hongchao had anything to share, because Hongchao is the engineer behind all this effort. Hongchao.
I think that mostly covers it. Very good. Yeah.
Okay. So we also got some feedback from the Argo folks. So the thing is very attractive to have a single source of truth representation of your application, which have abstractions inside. So the user basically just need to define very limited field like this. But this won't stop you to put the OAM object directly in the repo of your application. It still works. You just need to define everything, like component app config, define every fields, just like what we do on Kubernetes. So all of these two approaches works. Okay, so this is basically I want to share with you folks. If you have any questions, anything you want to discuss, just let us know.
Thank you, Lei and Hongchao. Yeah, as he mentioned, if you have any questions or any suggestions, please feel free to drop us a line, and we can have more discussions along that line. So next item I think is by Brian, and some application level entry point designs. I don't know, Brian, do you have any news or new development you want to share with the community?
Okay, so I did update and I moved the request over to the spec. And I can actually show you what the request, it's now 422.
Do you want to share your screen, or you want?
I'm gonna do that in a second here. Oh, it says host disabled screen share.
Okay, yeah, I need to enable that. Sorry for that.
Yep. No problem.
Okay, now you can share, I think.
Okay, so what I did is, again, I moved this to spec. It's now 422. Defined that an entry point is a way that data is accepted and results are emitted. Ultimately, kind of thought, just like we define other things, that this entry points would have, a schematic that you define, and then you can build entry points outside of everything else, and then point to them when you build your components. So this was kind of an example I went through and said, okay, I would define, I'd create an entry point definition called DIMC and entry point. That's something that we use in and define it. So this would be my schematic for it. And then this would be an example definition that would be called, example app DIMC entry point. But we want to make sure that we can parameterize these so that they could be mutable. So what we're suggesting is that entry points get added into the component spec then. So you would list an entry point with the entry point ref and the name of it, kind of in this way. So I could have, multiple entry points, obviously an input and an output, or multiple inputs if I could take that. And so then what I could do at that point is, even though I'm pulling in an entry point that's defined in a schema somewhere else, I can use that entry point and add parameters to it within my component. So, in this particular case, what I said is, okay, if I want to be able to change one of those values, I could just go to that particular field path and set that as a parameter inside of my component to know that I can pull this entry point definition in, but I'm still going to allow you to change parameters when you build your application configuration. So that's kind of how we're hoping that this could be added, so that entry points could be used over multiple components that would be identical. But once I bring them into my system, or build them as part of my component, I could just make them mutable inside of it. By specifying one of those items in the schematic as a parameter.
Thank you, Brian. Just one quick question.
Sure.
I didn't get a chance to look at this before. So you have entry point. Do you have exit point?
So we just say entry point could be entry point into my container, or an entry point for data that I create inside the container to some external system. So that we consider an entry point either, and that's why I kind of defined it up here, is it describes how data is accepted and results are emitted. So even though technically it would be an exit point, it's really an entry point to something else. And that's why we wanted to make sure that the parameters are immutable, so that basically I could say that I can output data in a certain way, but I don't know where it actually has to go. So I might be able to output something to an API, but I don't know where you're actually going to host that API. So you have to put in a couple of parameters to let me know where that is, but I'm going to define when I build my component that I'm compliant with that API, and maybe I put a default value in when I build the entry point. And then basically what I do is when I define the component itself and I add the entry point here, I can, if I require you to put it, I could just, put required as true in an entry point location and force you then in your app config to tell me where I'm actually sending the data to that particular API. That was kind of the thought behind this.
I see.
So hopefully that somewhat makes sense as to how we're trying to do this.
Yeah. I think I get the idea.
So yeah, we're not trying to say they're entry points and exit points. We're saying that everything is an entry point, whether it's in or out. And that's just kind of, we didn't want to create two separate words so that it was, ingest and egress.
I see. Another question. If anyone else has some questions.
Well, I have questions about the relationship between this and sort of the existing body of route traits and ingress traits and everything else.
Yeah, and also on top of that, we have this data dependency here. We have this data output, data input. What's the relation between that? That's my question too.
So what we're, how do you define if you have data inputs and data outputs? How do you define when they're actually custom APIs, and I have an API schema that I need to follow? It's not just a path to data or a data type. What we're really trying to define is I have once my container starts up, it exposes an API. Now I want you to be able to send data to that API. I'm telling you all the parameters that API has, but I'm also kind of defining that API schema for you at the same time. That's kind of what we're really getting at here.
I see.
So it's not really just, where data exists, you know, like I'm mounting a particular volume and that's where the data is, or there's a particular folder on my network that I'm going after. We're trying to define something that's, you know, much more complex.
I see.
You know, I mean, think about it. If you're just starting up something that hosts a service, how are you ever going to get data there if you don't tell people what that is?
Is that part of kind of a runtime API or time?
Basically, what I'm getting at is, say my contain hosts a service that has, you know, a network API on it. To tell you all the parameters that that API needs for you, you know, once I expose it.
I see.
So what I'm doing is I'm kind of defining those.
I see.
In
How is the
So-
consumer of that API supposed to get the contract that you're declaring here?
So that's why we kind of defined the schema itself outside of my component. So I would create an entry point definition outside, and then I would declare that I'm using that entry point in my component.
Yeah, I guess I'm just missing it. So if I'm gonna say there's a REST API and you know you got a Swagger or something, right?
Right.
They're gonna get that Swagger from the endpoint, not from
Right,
using
but
this, right?
but so I guess where I'm getting at is, how do you know so you're gonna say in your definition that I have these particular ports available, but how do you know which port is actually the one hosting that particular API? And how can I say, well, I can't have you run that API on that port because I'm using it for something else and I want you to switch it. These are the kind of things we're trying to define.
Yeah, I mean, at an infrastructure level, I sort of get it, but not at a. If you're really talking about schema, I don't get it anymore. But maybe you're not.
Right, and I'm not saying, you know, I'm not saying how it may particularly work, but there are going to be properties of an entry point that I need to let you know about. That, or on the opposite side is, I can, you know, I know that I can output data to a certain type of network service, but I don't know how that network service is defined on your network. So I just tell you that I can output to it. And what I want you to do, and I'm going to, you know, grab a generic definition of how that service is configured and give you parameters to be able to set during your application configuration, so that you can basically tell me where I'm sending the data to. So it may not be the full Swagger definition of the API itself, but some of the variables inside of there that I need to set.
I have another question, just along that line. If it's a REST, kind of like a REST API input, where does this define the output? So normally when you call a REST API, you have the parameter in, then there's a parameter like result out, right? Does this also include it outside? It's not
Correct. I mean, I just put one thing here. We're inside of ours. See, like we have in, out, you know, a bunch of different options, and we'd say that we would define schemas for all of these.
Okay, so sounds like
I just put one. I was trying to put an example here to just basically say an entry point is defined by a schema. Then you take that schema and you apply it to a component to say, you know, what it does. And then if I want to be able to make one of those, you know, one of the attributes inside of an entry point mutable. I just define it as a parameter inside of my component definition.
Component is a basically compile time or infrastructure parameter. The REST API sounds like a runtime definition. How does that?
Right, but so say I created a RESTful API, but so in our particular world, we have, so I need something that's called like an AE title, which is like a security name, the port to be able to talk to something. Well, I don't care what anybody wants to call it. I might have a default, my underscore AET, but I don't care what you actually call that. Instead of trying to set that as a configuration inside of my system, what I say is when you're sending me data, just tell me what you want to call me and I'll respond to you. So what I'm trying to do is create a way for things that I know when you're going to send me data that I can set easily myself. So in our world, these particular items normally are interchangeable. Like I can change the port that I listen on. These are things that we custom do in our applications all the time. I let you change, the name you want to call me and the port that you're going to call me on by default, pretty much for every application. Well, there's always a default that shows up in the screen. What we want to say is, I don't need to know really where those sit inside of your actual, your particular container. Just expose those to me so that I can set them as parameters. Tell me what they currently are, because maybe I can just consume them that way. I'll just, those are things that I have to put in my system because I have to know where I'm sending, and we have to call each other the same names. And that's kind of what I'm really getting at, is there are always going to be some things that need to be defined. Let me see if I can give you some of the other entry point information. If I bring up my other document here, this might be a little more helpful. So when we're talking about things that are a little more on the RESTful side, things like, there's particular headers, how I want you to send me the data back. Well, I might be able to send it back as a JPEG or a PNG or, a TIFF, but you tell me when, I'm allowed to, once I process your data and I create a rendering, I can send it back to you as a JPEG, a TIFF, or a PNG. That's just what my application does. But maybe you only accept PNGs. Well, I want to be able to tell you that when you send me data, send it as a PNG. And that's kind of what we're doing is we're saying, like, maybe by default, I can put this or this or this, but you can then go in and change the parameter. I don't need to know inside of the application where you do that. I just need to know it's part of the way you send data back to me.
Okay, I got it. Anyone else have any questions?
Yes, I I have a question for Brian. So how does the like looking at your some of your examples here where you have URLs and ports, does the proposal say anything about how application code gets access to that information? Like if I set a parameter to change the URL of an entry point, realistically, what does application code need to do to get that information?
Right. So that's why we make sure that the only time when I'm changing a parameter, that's why so when we initially did this, and maybe this will be helpful. The way that we define this is when, oops, let me escape here, Come on, go back. So when we initially did this, what we said is I would define basically my default here, okay? And then I can just use it inside of my component. Only when I set this parameter, so it's only available to be changed if when I'm defining my component, I make it a parameter. If I don't make it a parameter, you're just going to have to look at the way that I defined it and use it that way.
So
So
when you,
the application code knows it because it's pulling in this and it says, oh, I know that I'm allowing this to be changed. So I'm going to look at the application config and see if they changed it.
so when you say application code knows this or application code pulls it in, like what's the mechanism? Is it hard coded? Does it talk to Kube, like the API server? Like how does it actually work?
So in our applications, what we would do is we would read the application config and we would look at the parameters and see if you defined a parameter for something that we knew we allowed you to set. So I'd be looking down the parameters and say, oh, did they change this? So when I start, I'm going to see if this got changed. And if it did, I'm going to put your value in instead of my default value.
So if I'm just repeat back to make sure I'm understanding correctly, every application, it sounds like every application that wants to interact with this feature needs to then be able to read all of the definitions, like the application, the app configs and things, to know what values were set. Have you thought about a way to inject these into the application without the application having to like read the deployment manifests?
Well, so again, if you just want to use it and you don't want someone to, so we did try this, just kind of making them all, like building the whole thing. Either way, if I make a parameter mutable, I'm going to have to read the application config to find the parameter value.
Well, I would think that I would think that the value of putting something like this in the spec would be that we could define it in such a way that the burden is not on application code to go find deployment manifests and read them, right? Like,
Well, and I wouldn't actually need that. So if I tell, so realistically, a user can, so say I'm a hospital and I know where you have to send to. So I'm going to define this output entry point. And what you do in your component is you actually just put the output entry point right here.
Mhm.
You wouldn't have to read the app config because you would already have the definition from the, from up here when I defined this.
So you're saying by making it a parameter, it means that during composition of the components and the app config, that value would be available to pass through in some other mechanism to application code, and then that prevents the need to have the application read those manifests. I'm just wondering, like, if that's correct, I'm just wondering if we can aim a little bit higher and try to make that connection a little bit stronger. Like, I think it's a bad outcome if the application code has to read deployment manifests, like kind of full stop. So like, what else could we add or change in this proposal that makes it so that it's a little bit more on rails, that by configuring this, we're providing data to the application that it needs.
Right, and again, I can do that here. We were just trying to say, okay, and really this comes to, I want to build an application one time. It might be a little bit more of a bar for an application to build something like this, but once you built it, then you can deploy. So we're thinking about algorithms built for medical imaging. So if I build a stroke detection algorithm for head CTs, I don't want to have to worry about how this gets integrated anywhere else. If anybody, has an OAM platform that we're kind of building our DICOM platform based on OAM. Once this is defined, I can now, take my algorithm and deploy it to every hospital in the world immediately. And I don't need to know kind of how they're going to receive data at their side. I just tell you that, I can send my data out through DICOM, which is the, this DIMC thing that I'm talking about. And I have a default DIMC out entry point defined that's just some generic information. And you just put in what your actual real values are. Because I guess you could just go into this particular, I can give you an output entry point for my application. And you could just go into the definition if you wanted to without actually making a parameter and edit them. In some particular cases, applications may say, look, I'm not going to read the application manifest. Just go in and I want you to edit the entry point definition directly. Just overwrite it with version 2, and that's good enough for me.
Okay, cool. So I
that's
think,
kind of what we're thinking.
Yeah, it sounds like it's a pretty interesting idea. I think the community would like to, because it's kind of new, we probably all wanted to digest it a little bit more, and
Sure.
we can come back maybe next time or in 2 weeks, or maybe because I think it's going to get to the holidays, maybe early next year we can converge
Sure.
again and have a more discussion on this.
And then one other thing while I have the floor here for a minute. I believe it was Kevin mentioned wanting to move scope up to the top of application config, and we would be very interested in doing the same thing. Because obviously we consider, a bunch of components built together for an application. What we're trying to do is, define that the scope of this particular application is to detect, say, stroke. But there might be, one particular component might be doing a 3D rendering, another one kind of does a segmentation, and the final one actually does, we don't want to have to keep defining scope. We just want to overall say that this all goes together, and that I could define for an application a single scope and just apply it across. So I know that that's been there in the past, and I don't know how to kind of, throw our backing behind his idea.
So I think you can upvote on Kevin's issue. I don't know if you have done that already. Comment on his.
Yeah, I think we should follow up the user case on the existing issue. So I think, Brian, maybe you can add your user case on that.
Okay.
This scenario is definitely very useful, and I think we need to fix that in our next release, thing like that.
Okay.
Yeah, cool. I think we're talking about the application level of scope, right?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. No,
Yeah.
It's something that we are, again, I didn't know how to, from my perspective.
Yeah. If you want to support, as Lei mentioned, I think it'd be great if you can support Kevin's issue with some more use cases, like real world use case, like your use case. And it's already it's already high on our top of our feature list, so it probably will get into next release. So
okay.
Yeah. In the meantime, if you have any design you want to add for the issue, please kindly just comment. So we'd like to see what kind of design you may looks like, or you can just even start to propose a change to the spec if you already have a design. So it's totally open, and we definitely want to have this feature.
Sure, and we've already kind of started to put it into our definition in our standard. So yeah, I could kind of copy some of that out, and I think I can do a little better job on the entry point to kind of cover the questions that were asked today as well.
Yeah. Okay.
So thanks for the time.
Great. So the next item I think is I think Microsoft have some thoughts, some high-level ideas about the OAM specs, or maybe next generation, or some evolvement, some enhancement there. Ryan, do you want to share something?
Not sure what you're referring to.
Oh, Lei, do you want to clarify a bit?
Yeah, I think the discussion is what will be the next step for the existing OAM spec, because we actually kind of mentioned that the first idea that we want to introduce a two-layer model. So first layer is a developer object, which is simple with simple abstraction. Second layer is the existing object, which will be named as control plane object. So this is the original idea. But just as Kevin also raised concern regarding to this model, and also we got feedback from Naptive folks that maybe we should involve the existing model to make it developer-centric, to make it more simple abstraction instead of introduce another layer at top. So I think this is also worth to discuss. So whether we want to, so for next step, whether we want to add a new layer at top, or we want to involve the existing object, for example, component app config, to make it more developer facing. So there should be, I think there should be both direction will have disadvantage and advantage, right? So I like to raise this discussion, especially for Microsoft also have some idea on this since we talked before. So this is this topic really about. Ryan, do you have any idea, or do you think have any opinion on that? I mean, Ryan from Microsoft. Sorry.
or you want to hear from Naptive guys too?
Yeah, from everybody who's adopting this model today, because this is also about how to migrate, right? Alibaba also have investment on that, so how to migrate if we want to involve the existing model, or we actually want to introduce another layer on top. So this is the discussion really about.
Well, just Kevin, I have an opinion, but it's the same one as I had before.
Mm-hmm.
Can you repeat that?
Yeah, from our perspective, we've been pursuing the component and application as a developer-facing model, and we were doing in spite of the fact that we thought it was a little complicated for developer use, right? So we were surprised to hear that somebody was coming up with a simplified model for developers that wasn't part of the standard. So, our position would be if component application is too complicated for developers, then let's fix that. Whatever that means. If that means coming up with a new thing, or slowly evolving the existing thing, but we think having two things is a bad thing.
Cool. What about Ryan?
Yeah, I mean, my perspective is actually pretty similar to Kevin's. When I've talked to folks internally, maybe this is a little bit of internal baseball, but in general, when I talk to stakeholders about OAM, there's a couple issues that I run into with positioning it as a developer-facing product. There's a certain extent, and I realize, the company we're in, maybe this is a controversial statement, but there's a certain amount of like Kubernetes-oo, like Kubernetes gross. Developer community is a little bit divided on whether or not they really want to embrace Kubernetes or really want to run away from it. Particularly with large enterprise customers, they either have a Kubernetes-centric strategy, or they try to isolate developers from Kubernetes, or they don't have a Kubernetes strategy and don't want to see it. So the fact that OAM sort of reads as Kubernetes, just perception, right, and marketing. People see it and they have a reaction, right? So that's sort of one thing is like, I know when we've talked about this, we've identified some places where the model is a little bit coupled to Kubernetes. There's also Kubernetes as a format, and whether if developers are the target, is Kubernetes the format we want to give them in the user experience. That doesn't exclude the ability to use Kubernetes objects as an option, or have Kubernetes objects stored at rest on a Kubernetes implementation. And then the other sort of thing there is, I generally feel like the the factoring of concepts that we have are the right concepts. So like
Yes.
components, traits, scopes, and then, you know, if it weren't for Kubernetes, if Kubernetes didn't exist, we would probably replace the application config concept with a concept called deployment. But we can't really do that because deployment is already a thing in Kubernetes that people know and ascribe meaning to. So I do feel like we have the right set of concepts. They're a little bit complicated, and they're a little bit sort of hard to get your head around and use together. There's a lot of verbosity. So I kind of see, I see an opportunity to make a model with these concepts that is a lot simpler and a lot easier for like a developer to approach. And I also kind of see the potential for us to evolve where we are to that. Because I don't think that we fundamentally have the wrong concepts. I think we're just missing a couple things. So that's my take. I sort of agree with Kevin's position, by the way. If we do end up with two things, one of them has to lose. Like that's sort of the law, right? Like if you introduce a new thing, then one of those two things is going to get the investment and one of them is not, unless the layering really makes sense.
Any inputs from the adaptive guys?
Yes, I think that the point of the point of Kevin and Ryan is very aligned with the vision of Native. In my opinion, the open application model have a lot of things that are good. For example, the concepts, the component concept, the traits, and the scope. I think that they are very good abstraction for the developers, and I think that the try to split Kubernetes and try to create a standard that is complete is abstraction of the Kubernetes. I think that is a good idea, in my opinion. I also believe that we need to evolve the standard. We need to create a new layer on top of the inside of the standard, but in a new concept, maybe deployment, maybe application model, maybe application, only application that represent the application better, the application that is deployed in the system. And I think that I think that this is the way, you know, that is the way that we need to continue evolving open application model.
Any update from you guys, like the product launching or prototype POC?
The idea of the prototype is we have delayed the delivery because we have a lot of things on the table. And currently we are working with Telefónica, that is a big telco in Spain, and we talk with this big telco about the open application model, and they are very interested about this. For the reason we had the delay the delivery. But our idea is try to have the first version of the product, or the first version of the MVP at the beginning of the next year in January.
Cool. Cool.
That is the deadline. That is
okay. Looking forward to that. Whenever you are ready, please demo it in our community. Let us know.
Yeah, yes, absolutely.
That'd be great. Yeah. Okay. So I think we get a pretty good sense from the community about this idea. And so the last item in our agenda is to talk about a dependency. We already have a dependency, some rough dependency model in our current OAM design. So we have more thoughts about how can we evolve this feature to be more developer facing, or maybe it's does not cover every scenarios. Is it not? Maybe it's on one side it could be too complicated to use. On the other side, it may be not powerful enough to cover every use case. Maybe Lei wanna have some share some of your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So we don't have a lot of time, but this issue actually require, I think, a lot of discussion. So I just raise the discussion and we can follow up offline. So the issue is, so right now we do have resource dependency as well as data input and output in component app config. But internally tried this a lot, and there are a lot of adapters internally in our team to leverage this feature to do a lot of things. So I think in general, this feature is very useful in OAM. But on the other hand, as we talked with Ren before, Ren from Microsoft before, so as long as we want to move to a model to more developer facing, we actually face the issue, how can we model this data input and output and dependency in the model layer? One example is for dependency, we could probably bring an abstraction like depends on. So we can claim two components and claim the first component depends on the second. So I think this one will be relatively easier to fix in the next stage of the model. But for data input and output, I mean, if I want to declare that a value is actually coming from the other component, that will be a little bit tricky in the model layer. For example, we can introduce something like functions inside this YAML, right? Let's say we can claim that this field actually comes from another field. We can kind of do that. So this is basically another way to do abstraction. Or we can actually move the data input and output to a separate place. For example, into a definition object. This may be also another choice, but I don't have a concrete design or idea on that. So I just trying to raise a question, raise this issue to the public community, because we basically need to fix that when we want to move to the next stage. I mean, to provide the developer facing object layer. So I think we need to fix that as long as we want to go to that stage.
And very
Yeah, I think
supportive as well of the idea of having dependencies between services dependencies between components that can provide data and can be configured or can bind to primitives like environment variables is something that could really resonate with developers and be very successful. So I'm very, very strongly supportive of the idea that we would invest more and take a harder look at features like that.
Yeah, I second. We have like an internal model that has sort of dependencies in it, and it injects things like credentials and JDBZ connections between a database and an application, and and these are all sort of missing from OAM at the moment. One thing I think would help is I know the data input output sort of is in there now, but I don't remember where it's documented. So if you could recirculate that so I could review what exists, that would help.
Yeah, thank you,
Help me
Kevin.
further the discussion.
I already posted the existing design doc, which has already been implemented in OAM runtime. Because it's experimental, so it's not part of the spec. So I think you can start from the design doc. You can also try out the feature based on that. So I think it's pretty straightforward in the design doc. I'm eager to see your feedback on that.
okay, great. I think this is really I wasn't aware that this is not in the formal spec yet. So yeah, then definitely it's
Yeah,
something that we
because
need to discuss.
we marked that feature as experimental because we are not very sure whether it's useful for the community. So we experiment a little bit in OAM runtime, but it seems that many people are asking for this feature. That's why I raised a discussion that we may want to finalize the design and make it part of the OAM spec. So I think this is a good start.
Yeah, definitely. So I think in 2 weeks, we probably won't have another meeting. It will be in New Year time. So we probably will see all you guys next year. This is a very constructive meeting. Anything else? If not, I'll see you next year, and have a happy holidays.
Happy holidays. Thank you.
Everyone.
Okay, see ya.
Happy holidays. Thank you.
See you.
Thanks. Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.